With this in mind, I want to use this presentation as an opportunity to talk you through my most recent exhibition, Prospect Park. This show was held at Neon Park's temporary project space, 215 Albion Street, in August 2018. Prospect Park presented a survey of recent works from the past 4 years, set across 3 warehouse spaces, and presenting fragments, residues, and speculative beginnings, as well as a number of entire works. This show offered a rare opportunity for me to formally, conceptually, and spatially think a range of works in direct relation to one another. In this way, the format of the survey is actually quite conducive to thinking through a talk like this. For as an artist, the survey-style show becomes a means to think through those larger questions that occupy one's practice, as questions of both space and of form, and to understand what it is to inhabit those questions as body, such that the survey show allows me to think a kind of sculptural lecture. And forgive me, as whenever I speak publicly, a lecture is typically what it becomes. But to think this lecture sculpturally becomes strangely analogous to the way I make exhibitions, which is, in a way, to think a space and its objects discursively, which is to say that the way I choose to both construct and to imagine exhibitions is as a type of unfolding of relations, in which the idea of syntax and the idea of choreography get strangely enmeshed. The way we move through language and the way we move through space becoming in the site of the exhibition somehow equivalent, and in this equivalence standing to trouble one another. So within this talk, I aim to map this process of unfolding as both syntax and as choreography through the Prospect Park exhibition. And I do so as a means to illustrate my thinking in constructing such an interplay of works. To this end, while in the past I have talked at length about individual works, this reflection focuses, as I am increasingly inclined to work, upon the interrelation between works as much as it does to any work in itself. Before I commence talking about Prospect Park, I want to make a slightly unorthodox move of talking first about someone else's art, not only as it's nice to mark one's own influences as an artist, but also as I think it is a productive point of reference throughout this talk. And that's this work, Socle du Monde by Piero Manzoni. So this work is a work I've been thinking about a lot lately, and for those of you that don't know the work, what you're looking at here is a piece that Manzoni made in 1961, and it consists of this iron plinth, which is roughly 1 meter square and about 80 centimeters in depth, placed in a field outside Herning, Denmark. Inscribed upon the side of the plinth, but appearing upside down, are the words Socle du Monde, base, or alternatively, plinth for the world. I think this work does a number of things, and it does them very well. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to primarily foreground the particular way it both breaks with its immediate past, but also anticipates a certain future. But I do this with a certain caveat that I very likely read this work in some ways against Manzoni, who was a kind of champion of the autonomous art object, as I see this work as marking a shift away from ideas of autonomy in art, which is to say, away from the artwork being considered primarily with reference to its own existence, as a kind of singular object. As what I believe this work does, in contrast to much of Manzoni's other work, is to invite us to read the sculptural object in a way that is rather deeply and necessarily related to the world it brings us into contact with. And in this way, rather than being understood as autonomous, it makes the sculptural form function much more like an optical device, through which we might otherwise see or encounter the world it brings us into contact with. So this thinking of the sculptural object as an optical device is an idea I will return to throughout this talk. But with this idea of optical devices in mind, I want to first introduce another image produced in the same decade, which I think is profoundly important to understanding Manzoni's work within its own historical moment. And that's this image. I think there's something remarkable about the way that Socle du Monde both anticipates and complicates the whole Earth image, or blue marble as it's come to be known. And this complicated relationship is a product of the different ways these two forms induce us to imagine the world. First released in 1968, the whole Earth image marked the shift into what has been called the planetary paradigm, which was the long arrival of consciousness of self thought in relation to the planet. And this shift in consciousness crystallized around the whole Earth image that it seemed to demand a reimagining of humankind's relationship to both itself and to its thinking of nature as part of one fragile and unified whole. And for this reason, it quickly became a symbol of the California counterculture movement, which centered upon this image as a kind of icon of wholeness and of unity. Yet what was obscured in this epochal dream of wholeness was the technology of its production, which was the American spacecraft which existed outside the frame, a technology which was a direct emanation of its military industries, such that this image was itself more complex than this epochal dream seemed to acknowledge. But in an oddly prescient way, I imagine Manzoni's Socle du Monde as somehow anticipating the whole Earth image and its complexities. This is not only as they both induce a kind of imagining of ourselves in relation to the planet, but also as the 180-degree turn of Manzoni's plinth seems to anticipate in a perverse way the 180-degree turn that would produce the whole Earth image. When the expansive gaze, previously directed outwards, returns on itself in order to produce this image. In my thinking, it is not hard to imagine the pedestal, particularly the monumental pedestal, as part of a lineage of power technologies which lead from the monument to the rocket engine, particularly in this shared axis of verticality. And if we think of the optics of this image, it's not unlike a monument. Produced at the height of the space race, it's an image that attempts to produce a singular, dominant, and ideologically charged perspective. And this perspective subtly pervades its other adopted uses. In anticipating this turn, I imagine Socle du Monde as becoming, in a way, its terrestrial equivalent, like a very rudimentary or crash-landed spacecraft. And this is part of Socle du Monde's remarkably deceptive simplicity, as it somehow draws the unifying and notionally universal dreams that seem to crystallize around the whole Earth image into question. What seems to be at first a purely megalomaniacal act to claim the whole Earth, in this case as an artwork, gets kind of beautifully undone in our encounter with the work, as rather than producing a single perspective, Socle du Monde is animated by this spontaneous multiplication of perspectives, which is felt as a type of wrongness in the encounter, a conflict between our senses of the world and the world it announces, which appears suddenly upside down. But this contestation of our gravity, in disorganizing our idea of art, also begins to animate the material of the work itself, for which Manzoni has curiously selected iron. And this is something that has always struck me about this work, as in the context of the claim this work makes, iron seems to draw a direct relation to the Earth's core, which is, of course, the point from which we intuitively understand the idea of up, as opposing the down of gravity. So iron, then, as the material of this inscription, seems to internally question the validity of its own claim in this simultaneous process of making and unmaking. And it becomes a sly nod, too, to this logic of displaced centers that's present in the homage to Galileo at the foot of the Manzoni's inscription, such that while Manzoni appears to inhabit the logic of the monument in this kind of megalomaniacal way, what I admire in this work is the very subtle, humorous, and even beautiful way that Manzoni makes of this a kind of broken logic, and in doing so produces a kind of anti-monument, a monument to uncertainty and instability, which is a monument also to the possibility of the world being otherwise. So what I discover in looking at Socle du Monde is a sculptural language which emerges in response to its own historical moment, which I think served in this deceptively simple way to trouble a consciousness of self understood in relation to the world that prevailed in this moment. Now, I foreground this work as within this legacy, part of what I attempt within my own practice is to ask what sculptural language can respond to a contemporary consciousness of self, thought in relation to the planet, and all of its current complexities and the urgencies these complexities engender. And this brings me now to my own work, which in many ways I tend to think of as a type of plinth for the world, which is also to say as a set of optical devices through which we might not only see the world, but also imagine the world otherwise. So we move now from the planet Earth to Herning, Denmark, to Albion Street and the Prospect Park exhibition. And I have to admit that this makes me slightly more fond of the architecture of this. The first thing you encountered as you approached the exhibition, which was held adjacent the Upfield train line in Brunswick, in two adjoining and recently vacated factory spaces, which still held many of the residues of the recent occupation, was a green neon glow coming from the shuttered lower street-facing windows, and the muted resonance of a percussive bass line carrying through brick and mortar. These are the first emanations of the soft edges of the exhibition, into which you enter via the left of two adjacent ground-level doors. These doors mark the central junction of the two warehouse spaces in which the exhibition was held. The right-hand door, which would lead to the lower levels, remained locked, so you entered through the left, which takes you into a narrow set of carpeted stairs, which ascend, switch back, and then ascend again. Entering this passageway, you realize that the factory is built to contain, as the stairwell seems largely silent, with only the very low boom of a percussion audible if you listen for it. Ascending the stairs, you encounter this. You have the same amount of hours in the day as Beyoncé, where perhaps only the frame announces that it's something out of place, seeming to work in concert with another nearby sign. Quality starts with you. We are entering a place of work. Topping the stairs, you enter a series of 3 small, brightly lit but largely vacated offices. Passing through this space, you encounter a large office printer, which seems to be ceaselessly printing documents at irregular but brief intervals. This work is printing every Elvis auction ending around the world in real time. Every few seconds, an A4 page is ejected from the machine, delivered neatly to the top of a stack, which is accumulating on the printer's finishing tray. Tracking in real time, this work becomes an obscure kind of timepiece, part hourglass, part market, part printer, part Elvis. Yet for all these parts and its consistent proliferation, insistently printing and accumulating, for all this fullness, the work is characterized more insistently by emptiness. Part of the horror of this work is that these things never sell. The auctions run down to 0, while almost always registering no bids. You get the sense that Elvis was once everything, the king, and now he's nearing nothing, that the desire is all slipping away. A slow second death, and an emptiness only heightened by this spectre of heightened desire. Indeed, part of the conceptual structure of this work we discover, speaking with the individual who has been employed to tend the machine, who appears to be the factory's solitary occupant, is that the printer is loaded with 159 kilograms of paper, Elvis's body weight when he died. So many seemingly worthless objects recorded and accumulating here in this immense aftermath of consumption, fullness and emptiness. These stacks of paper, the body, 159 kilograms at death, fullness and emptiness. In contrast to the musicality of both Elvis and Beyoncé, the printer provides a soundtrack to this space, becoming an arrhythmic pulse, a carbon clock marking time not by the decay of the atom, but rather the decay of desire. Thought of as a timepiece, this work turns all time into a time of waiting for the next auction to finish, waiting for the next print, waiting for something to happen. A waiting echoed by the invigilator who is waiting for the finisher tray to fill, waiting for the paper to run out, waiting for day's end, waiting too for something to happen. This waiting, as an emptying of desire, an enduring passing away, presents an odd residency in our present moment, becoming a kind of empty time. And it becomes in this way a counterpoint to the mantra on the coffee mug. You have the same amount of hours in the day as Beyoncé, a time so full in which we are all Beyoncé, only not yet. You just have to work 24 hours a day while drinking large mugs of coffee. Yet this full time and empty time just seem to collapse into the same reality on the factory room floor, where this affirmation becomes an acquiescence to your impossible circumstance. As in this mantra, time is duration and time is money collapse into one another, such that this slogan becomes both trivially true but also patently false. Of course, we share the same calendar with Beyoncé, producing a kind of charged proximity. Yet to think time is money, it at once infinitely separates you from Beyoncé. And this apparent fullness of time is revealed in its more harsh day-to-day reality of labor time, market time, machine time, a time of not yet being Beyoncé, which we again recognize as a time of waiting. Cued already to think these ideas of time and of desire, both of which collapse into one another here in the reality of the factory in this play of emptiness and fullness. Proceeding further, descending to the lower levels, we encounter a different articulation of this same collapse, curiously literalized in a work titled Repressing Desire, the object of which has been to take Bob Dylan's album Desire and melt it down and repress it into U2's album Desire, and vice versa. Yet if we assemble this process, we do so only in reverse, as what we are faced with in the first instance is simply 2 vinyl records framed together, one beside the other. On the left, we see U2's 1988 Desire. On the right, we find Bob Dylan's 1976 Desire. The first cue to what may have happened between these 2 records is given by a parallel narrative presented as a leaflet multiple nearby, in which we learn of the first record label that promoted house music. The mention of house music here notably produces a sensory crossover with the music we first encountered seeping through the front walls, yet which now returning to the lower levels pervades the space, from a source we are yet to encounter. We learn from the leaflet of another factory, in which Trax Records first begun producing house records. Yet with no cash flow, their business model was to buy surplus records from other labels, unsold blues, jazz, and disco recordings, grind these up, and press them into the house music records for a fraction of the price of virgin vinyl. such that the house records that Trax was producing, a musical style itself